Some of you might be thinking, is Justin lost? Didn't he already do the welcome? Totally fair questions. Or maybe you're wondering why Pastor Matt looks so much younger and way more handsome this morning. Either way, don't be alarmed. I'm not lost. Your eyes aren't fooling you. I'm clearly not Pastor Matt. Now, lucky for you, maybe unlucky, I get the privilege of filling in for Matt today. Now, some of you know a little bit about me. You know my love for the St. Louis Cardinals, even more so after the last 2 days. You know that my daughter could probably get up here and do a much better job than I could. And you've probably learned I've got a lot of bad jokes. But there's still a lot of things about me that you don't know. So this morning, I'm going to share a bit of my story with you. But I don't want this to just be about me. I want to show you how God was at work in my life, even when I wasn't looking for him. And if I had to sum up the first part of my story in one sentence, it would be this. Even when I wasn't looking for God, he was already pursuing me. And I think that's actually one of the biggest themes all throughout the Bible. Jesus tells a story in Luke chapter 15 that really brings this to life. It starts by saying in verse 1, "Now the tax collectors and the sinners were all gathered around Jesus to hear Jesus." Now, one thing you've got to understand is tax collectors in Jesus' time were some of the most hated people around. They worked for Rome, so they were seen as sellouts, like they had betrayed their own people, corrupt. And then Luke just says sinners, which is kind of a catch-all for people who are seen as morally messy or not measuring up. And somehow those are the people who were drawn to Jesus. In other words, these are not the people the religious leaders would associate with. And we'll get to that more in just a second. But all these people were gathered around Jesus. Then in verse 2, it says the religious people in the background are criticizing Jesus for surrounding himself with this group of people. It says, "But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, 'This man welcomes sinners and eats with them.'" Now, maybe you know what it's like when people stand around behind you muttering behind your back. So this kind of reminds me when I go to Missouri and people stand around muttering behind my back saying, "There's the guy who hangs out with Cubs fans." Now, Jesus goes on to say this in verse 3 through 7 in response to those religious leaders grumbling about who he is surrounded by. Then Jesus told them this parable. "Suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Doesn't he leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? And when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders and goes home. Then he calls his neighbors and friends together and says, 'Rejoice with me, I have found my lost sheep.' I tell you that in the same way, there will be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who do not need to repent." What I love about the picture that Jesus gives here is that Christianity is not first about lost people finding God. It's about a God who goes looking for lost people. And when I look back on my life now, that's what I see. Not a story of me searching for God, but a story of God pursuing me long before I ever knew what he was doing. And for me, that story starts in a small town in northeast Missouri called Vandalia. Now, when I say small, I mean small. We had 2 stoplights. Actually, no. Calling them stoplights is probably giving them too much credit. These were blinking 4-way stoplights. It was the kind of town where everybody knew everybody. If you walked into the grocery store and you saw somebody you didn't recognize, you didn't wonder who they were. You just assumed they were from out of town. And that's the kind of place that I grew up in. I grew up in a family with a mom and a dad and 2 older sisters. And my childhood felt pretty normal, at least to me. I was into things like the Ninja Turtles. I had a Teddy Ruxpin. Does anybody remember those? Yeah. I played baseball. I loved swimming, just normal kid stuff. And then just shy of my 6th birthday, my dad passed away from pancreatic cancer. And what's strange is I don't remember noticing how sick he was getting. Apparently, he'd been getting worse for years, but I was so young that I just didn't really understand what was happening. Even at his funeral, I don't remember fully understanding what was going on. I remember running around. I remember playing. I remember wanting a soda from one of those old vintage Coke machines because I thought it looked really cool. And looking back now, it still sounds strange to say that out loud, but that's just the reality of being a little kid going through a tragedy. I just didn't really understand what I'd lost. And I think it was probably much harder on my sisters than it was on me because they were old enough to really feel the weight of it. Now, I don't remember a lot from that season other than different people coming over to help. And my mom, who always did her best to take care of us, doing what she could to provide. But what I do remember is that about a year later, my mom met someone new, and eventually they got married. And I know for some people, having a step-parent can be a really hard or a complicated thing. But for me, because I was so young when my dad passed away, my stepdad became the only dad I really knew. So to this day, he's not really stepdad, he's just dad. And he stepped in and he raised me as his own, and I was incredibly blessed by that. Now, along with my stepdad came 2 stepsisters. So just like that, I had 4 older sisters. Let me tell you how much fun that was. Justin didn't need a lot of time in the bathroom, let me say that. Now we weren't really much of a church family. On special occasions, we might go to my grandparents' church, but outside of that, church just wasn't really part of our normal life. When we did go, there wasn't exactly a lot there for kids. My church experience mostly consisted of me playing with Hot Wheels during the sermon and hoping nobody noticed. Now, some of you might be thinking, where are the Hot Wheels at right now? You'd love to be playing with some. I get it. But even with everything that had happened, life still felt pretty normal to me. But living in a small town, there also wasn't a whole lot to do. And when there's not much to do, you don't always make the best choices. I didn't get into a ton of trouble. My sisters took care of that enough for them. But I definitely started going down some roads that I shouldn't have. I had my first, and thankfully last, cigarette at age 10. I had my first alcoholic drink at 12. And by 15, most Friday and Saturday nights were spent at parties and drinking because there just really wasn't much else going on. And here's why I tell you that. Because when I look back now, I can see something I absolutely could not see then. Just because I couldn't see God working didn't mean he wasn't working. And maybe that's where some of you are right now. Maybe life doesn't feel very spiritual. Maybe it just feels normal or painful, confusing, or messy. Maybe you're carrying some loss. Maybe you've got questions. Maybe you're not even sure where God fits into your life right now. But just because you can't see his hand at work doesn't mean he's absent. The Bible says in Romans chapter 5, verse 8, "But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." And that verse explains so much of my story, because God's love for me didn't begin the moment I noticed him. He was already moving toward me long before I ever moved toward him. And for me, that started becoming more visible in a really unexpected way. Not because I was searching for God, but because I found myself around church. See, right before my 16th birthday, something happened that finally got me into church. Now, I wish I could tell you it's because I was searching for God, but nope, it was for a girl. I started dating a girl who was a couple years younger than me, and we both knew that her parents probably weren't going to like the fact that she was dating a guy 2 years older, and specifically me. What I did know was that her family went to church and that her dad was actually a deacon there. So I had this genius teenage thought: if I start going to church, her parents will like me. So just to be clear, I did not start going to church because I was hungry for God. I started going because I was trying to win over her parents. And if you're wondering whether God can use questionable teenage motives, apparently he can. Because the first Sunday I went to church with her, they had a younger guy there who was interviewing to become their youth and music minister. And his name was Greg. After he was hired, he really took me under his wing. He found out I was learning to play bass guitar, so he started spending time teaching me how to play. And before long, he had me helping lead worship for the youth group. He got me involved. He got me around other students. He took time with me. And more than anything, he made me feel valued. he made me feel like I mattered. And I can look back now and realize that even though I thought I'd shown up for one reason, God had another reason for having me there. And that matters because sometimes we think that our story with God only begins when we finally get serious. But a lot of times, God is already at work long before we have the language for it. Jesus says in John chapter 6, verse 44, "No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him." And it wasn't until years later that I finally realized what was actually happening. God was drawing me. He used a relationship. He used a youth pastor. He used music. He used community. And even when I didn't fully understand what he was doing, he was drawing me. But here's the important part. Just because I had actually gotten around church did not mean I actually knew Jesus. And I think that's where a lot of people find themselves. They think, I'm involved, so I must be good, right? At least that's the mindset that I had. And I didn't think anything needed to change. Then later that summer, the church hosted a revival. But this wasn't just any revival. They had a group come in called the Power Team. Now, if you've never heard of them, just picture a bunch of American Gladiator-looking people, so they look just like me, who showed up to break bricks with their heads, bend rebar using their teeth, and rip phone books in half, and they would somehow connect all these feats of strength to Jesus. Now, for those younger people out there, if you don't know what a phone book is, okay, never mind. You're never going to need to know anyway. Anyway, this was a week-long event, and on the last night, they gave people the opportunity to respond and put their trust in Jesus. And to be honest, even though I had been going to church for a few months at that point, I still didn't really understand what that meant. So my plan was easy, to just stay right where I was. But then one of my good friends went forward, and then another, and then another. And pretty soon I realized I was one of the only people in my friend group still sitting there. I then thought, I don't want to be the only one not doing this. So I got up and I went forward too. Then afterward, the girl that I was dating came running up to me all excited. "I'm so happy you accepted Jesus." And I remember basically responding like, "Yeah, me too." But the truth was, I had a church moment, but I hadn't had a surrender moment. See, I'd gone forward. I experienced the moment. I did what everyone else was doing. But the truth is, nothing really changed. And I think that's probably where some people in this room know exactly what I mean. See, you know the songs. You know how church works. You know when to stand and you know when to sit. You know how to look like everything's okay. But being around church is not the same thing as surrendering your life to Jesus. And that was me. I had responded to a moment, but I had not yet truly responded to Jesus. Then a couple months later came the night that changed everything, and I didn't see it coming. See, I just finished the first week of my junior year of high school. And that Saturday night, there was a Christian rock concert at the church. So I picked up my girlfriend, we went to the concert, I dropped her off afterward, and then I headed home. Now, here's a little backstory first. By this point, thankfully, all my sisters had moved out on their own. And a few weeks before this, our air conditioner had stopped working. So instead of fixing it right away, my parents decided to just use a couple window air conditioner units to get us through the rest of the summer, like a lot of people would do. They put one in their room and then one in our den. And because of that, I'd been sleeping on the floor in the den so I wouldn't be too hot at night. So after the concert, I walked into the den and my feet were absolutely soaked. It had stormed, and apparently the roof had started leaking right where I'd been sleeping. So I obviously wasn't going to be sleeping there that night. So when my parents got home, they told me to just sleep on the floor in their room. We'd figure everything else out the next day. And let me tell you, that's exactly what every 16-year-old wants to do, is to sleep on the floor in their parents' room. But I also didn't want to sleep in a 90-degree room either. So that's what I did. And the next thing I remember is my dad waking me up, telling me to grab the dog and get out of the house because it was on fire. So I grabbed the dog and I started running toward the side door. Before I ran out, I looked back and I could see an orange glow through the house. And then I saw the flames. I ran outside, and once I got in the yard, I could see fire coming through the roof, right next to where my bedroom was. I stood there in the middle of the night watching firefighters try to put out the fire in our house. Now, I'm not standing up here pretending I understand every reason why things happen the way they do, but I can tell you this. It wasn't until much later that I could see the mercy of God in the middle of that night, because what felt like inconvenience turned out to be mercy. See, at the time, it all just felt like one thing after another. The air conditioner breaking, the roof leaking, having to sleep somewhere else. It felt random. It felt frustrating. It felt like an interruption. But looking back now, I can see that God used all of it to protect me and to wake me up. And standing there in the middle of all that, I finally understood something I hadn't understood before. Jesus didn't just want me around church. He wanted me. Not a cleaned up version of me, not a church-looking version of me, just me. And it was right there, standing outside, watching our house burn, that I truly surrendered my life to Jesus. Not because I'd earned it, not because I'd figured everything out, not because I'd finally become good enough, but because that's what grace does. That's what God does. He comes after people. And I think that's exactly what Jesus is showing us in Luke 15. See, the shepherd doesn't just wait for the lost sheep to figure it out or somehow make its way back home, because sheep rarely do. The shepherd goes after it, and that's what he'd been doing in my life all along. So the next morning, even though I'd basically lost everything I owned, I still wanted to go to church. So I showered at my sister's house. I borrowed clothes that were 2 sizes too big for me from my brother-in-law, and I went. And that morning in Sunday school, I was shown the first verse I ever memorized. And you may know it too. Philippians 4:13. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And later that same day, while I was at my sister's house, 2 of my friends showed up at the door. When I answered, they gave me a big hug and handed me an envelope. Inside that envelope was money they'd collected from other friends so I could go buy clothes for the upcoming school week. And I still think about that moment to this day, because it was one of the first times I really understood what it looks like when God's love shows up through his people. It gave me a whole new understanding of generosity. It showed me that faith is not just something you say, it's something that shows up in how you love people. And from that point forward, I started getting more involved in church. I started helping lead worship on Sunday mornings. I became more involved in youth ministry. I started even speaking at youth events. And over time, I began to sense that God might actually be calling me into ministry. I pushed that aside at first because I thought, that can't be me. I'm not capable of that. I'm not good enough for that. That's for other people, not for me. But eventually, I couldn't ignore it anymore. When I went to college, I started out with a completely different major. But before long, I finally surrendered to the idea that God was calling me into ministry. Now, I can see none of it was random. Not the good parts, not the messy parts, not even the moments that felt like everything was falling apart. Because all along, I had a shepherd who was coming after me. And the truth is, I didn't go looking for him first. He came looking for me. And when I finally realized it, it changed everything. Not all at once, not perfectly, but it changed the direction of my life. And I wish I could tell you from that point on, everything was easy, that I just walked in a straight line with Jesus from there on out. But that's not how real life works. Honestly, it was only the beginning. Take a listen to the song with me.